I heard the metallic crack echo across the endless red expanse like a gunshot. Steam hissed from beneath the bonnet of my Toyota Land Cruiser. I sat frozen as the vehicle shuddered to a final, definitive halt. The engine seized with a grinding finality that spoke of catastrophic failure. The sudden silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind across Spinifex grass. I stepped out onto the scorching sand of the great sandy desert. The heat hit me like a physical blow, a dry, merciless furnace that seemed to steal the moisture from my lungs with each breath. My geological survey equipment rattled in the back of the ute as I lifted the bonnet. I already knew what I'd find. Coolant pooled beneath the vehicle, dark against the red earth. The acrid smell of overheated metal filled my nostrils. The water pump had failed completely, taking the radiator with it. In the civilized world it would have been an inconvenience. Here, 200 kilometers from the nearest station and beyond the range of my radio, it was potentially a death sentence. I pulled out my map with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, I told myself, but from the adrenaline of sudden crisis. My finger traced the thin line that marked the track I'd been following, a barely maintained route used by mining companies and the occasional pastoralist. The nearest homestead lay somewhere to the southeast, perhaps 40 kilometers as the crow flies, but I wasn't a crow. I'd have to follow the tracks, winding through creek beds and around rocky outcrops, easily doubling the distance. The sun hung like a merciless eye in the cloudless sky. I checked my watch, 2:30 p.m. In a few hours, the temperature would begin its grudging descent from what I estimated was already pushing 45 degrees Celsius. I had perhaps 2 hours of the day's worst heat remaining, then the long walk through the cooler evening and night ahead. The decision crystallized in my mind with the clarity that comes in moments of absolute necessity. Stay with the vehicle and hope someone would eventually find me, or walk for help while I still had the strength. I knew the statistics. Search parties looked for vehicles, not people. And my route today had been a deviation from my planned survey grid. Nobody would think to look for me here for days, perhaps weeks. By then, the desert would have claimed me. I shouldered my small day pack and filled my water bottles from the larger container in the back of the ute. I calculated with the methodical precision of a man whose life depended on mathematics. 3 liters to start, plus what remained in my thermos. Perhaps enough for 2 days if I was careful, if I was very, very careful. I'd spent the better part of 15 years reading the desert's story written in stone and sand. As a geologist for mining companies throughout Western Australia's remote interior, I'd developed an intimate understanding of the continent's harsh heart. Few white men possessed such knowledge. I could identify rock formations that promised water-bearing strata. I recognized the subtle signs of seasonal streams. I navigated by stars that most city dwellers had never seen through their veil of electric light. The great sandy desert wasn't unknown territory to me. I'd mapped portions of its geology, collected samples from its ancient formations. I'd learned to respect its capacity for killing the unprepared. This knowledge formed the bedrock of a confidence that perhaps bordered on hubris as I began my walk towards salvation. I'd survived difficult situations before. A breakdown in the Pilbara that had left me walking for 12 hours in temperatures that wilted lesser men. A navigation error in the Gibson Desert that had stretched a 2-day survey into 5 days of careful rationing and precise route finding. Each experience had reinforced my belief in my own competence, my ability to read the desert's moods and work within its constraints rather than against them. My geological training had taught me to think systematically, to observe and catalog details that might prove crucial. I knew that the Great Sandy's red sand and scattered breakaways concealed a complex hydrogeology, with underground water flowing along ancient fault lines and collecting in hidden basins. The Aboriginal people had survived here for thousands of years by understanding these secrets. While I didn't pretend to possess their ancestral knowledge, I trusted in my scientific education and accumulated experience to see me through. The pack on my shoulders contained the tools of my trade alongside basic survival supplies, a GPS unit with batteries that would last perhaps 3 days of continuous use. Geological maps marked with my own annotations about water sources and vehicle tracks. A small first aid kit, emergency food bars and a space blanket that might mean the difference between life and death during the cold desert nights. My clothing was practical, a broad-brimmed hat, long-sleeved shirt, and boots designed for walking on rocky ground. I'd dressed for a day's work, not a marathon journey across one of the world's most hostile environments. As I began walking, following the faint, double rut of tire tracks that represented my lifeline to civilization. I felt a familiar stirring of confidence. The desert was dangerous, yes, but it was also predictable if you understood its rules. Conserve water, avoid the worst heat of the day, maintain your direction, and don't panic. These were principles I'd learned and applied successfully before. How different could this situation be? The tracks led generally southeast, winding between low hills of red sandstone and across flat expanses where the only vegetation was scattered shrubs and the occasional ghost gum standing sentinel against the horizon. I settled into a steady pace, my geologist's eye automatically cataloging the landscape, even as my conscious mind focused on navigation and conservation of energy. The rock formations told stories of ancient seas and long-vanished rivers, of geological epochs when this desert had been lush and green. Now it was a testament to the planet's capacity for transformation, beautiful and terrible in its austere grandeur. The first day passed with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to fieldwork. I walked during the cooler hours of late afternoon and evening, stopped to rest during the brief desert twilight, then continued by starlight with the aid of my torch to illuminate the tracks at my feet. The Southern Cross wheeled overhead in a display of celestial magnificence impossible to see from any city. The desert air carried sounds with crystalline clarity, the distant call of a nightjar, the rustle of some small creature moving through the spinifex, the whisper of sand stirred by the gentle night breeze. I rationed my water carefully, allowing myself small sips at predetermined intervals, wetting my lips and tongue rather than drinking deeply. The night air was blissfully cool compared to the day's furnace heat. I made good progress, covering what I estimated to be 15 kilometers, before stopping to rest in the pre-dawn hours. I found shelter in the lee of a small breakaway, wrapped myself in the space blanket, and tried to sleep despite the hard ground and the growing ache in my legs. Dawn came with a gradual lightening of the eastern sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. I checked my GPS and confirmed my position. I was indeed following the track southeast. My calculations suggested I'd covered roughly 1/3 of the distance to the nearest station. The knowledge provided a boost to my morale as I prepared to endure the day's heat. I'd rest during the hot hours, conserving water and energy, then continue walking as the sun began its descent. The second and third days followed a similar pattern, but with subtle changes that a less experienced desert traveler might have missed. The tracks became fainter in places, partly obscured by wind-blown sand, or washed out by some long-ago flash flood. I found myself stopping more frequently to verify my route, sometimes retracing my steps when the trail disappeared entirely, only to pick it up again 50 meters away. These navigation challenges consumed time and energy, precious resources I could ill afford to waste. My water consumption, despite my careful rationing, was exceeding my planned allowance. The desert's dry air pulled moisture from my body with relentless efficiency. Even my controlled breathing couldn't prevent the steady loss of precious fluids. By the end of the third day, I realized with growing concern that I'd consumed nearly half my water while covering perhaps 60 kilometers. At this rate, my supplies would be exhausted long before I reached help. The fourth day brought the first serious test of my resolve and expertise. The track I'd been following for 3 days simply vanished, erased by a combination of wind erosion and time. I spent precious hours searching for its continuation, walking in expanding circles while the morning heat built to its crushing crescendo. When I finally accepted that the track was gone, I faced the first of many critical decisions that would determine whether I lived or died in the Great Sandy Desert. Using my geological maps and GPS, I plotted a direct course toward where I believed the nearest homestead lay. This meant abandoning the security of following human-made paths in favor of striking out across unmarked desert. I'd trust entirely in my navigation skills and my understanding of the terrain. The decision required considerable courage. Getting lost now would almost certainly be fatal. But my confidence in my abilities remained strong. I'd navigated by compass and stars before, and the GPS provided a technological backup that previous generations of desert travelers had lacked. The landscape began to change as I walked southeast. The red sand gave way to harder ground, broken by low ridges of exposed rock and scattered gravel plains that stretched to the horizon. The walking was more difficult here, requiring constant attention to foot placement to avoid twisted ankles on loose stones. But my geological training allowed me to read the terrain in ways that might save my life. I recognized formations that suggested underground water, identified rock types that weathered to create natural shelters. I began to understand the subtle signs that marked seasonal watercourses. By the end of the first week, I'd covered an estimated 80 kilometers. But my water supplies had dwindled to less than a liter. The careful rationing that had sustained me through the first days was no longer sufficient. My body was beginning to show signs of serious dehydration despite my efforts at conservation. My urine had darkened to a deep amber. My mouth felt lined with cotton. The beginnings of a constant headache throbbed behind my eyes. More concerning was my growing difficulty in concentrating. My mind seemed to drift during navigation tasks that required precise attention to detail. The heat had become a living enemy, a presence that pressed down on me with physical weight during the daylight hours. Even my geological knowledge seemed insufficient against the desert's relentless assault. The temperatures during the day now exceeded anything in my previous experience. I found myself forced to seek shelter for longer periods, huddled in whatever shade I could find, while precious hours ticked away. Sleep became elusive despite my exhaustion. The nights were cold enough to require my space blanket, but the hard ground and constant thirst made rest fitful and unrewarding. I'd wake before dawn feeling more tired than when I'd lain down, my legs cramped and my back aching from another night spent on rocks and sand. The physical discomfort was beginning to erode my mental resilience. I caught myself making small errors in navigation and judgment that would have been unthinkable during my first days of walking. As my water bottle grew lighter with each carefully measured sip, I faced the grim arithmetic of survival. At my current rate of consumption and travel, I'd run out of water within the next day, possibly sooner if the heat continued to intensify. I'd covered perhaps a third of the distance to help, maybe less if my navigation had been off, or if the homestead I sought had been abandoned or moved. For the first time since beginning my walk, I confronted the very real possibility that my geological expertise and desert experience might not be enough to save me. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool pre-dawn air. I'd always been the competent one, the professional who could handle whatever the Outback threw at him. But the Great Sandy Desert was proving to be a more formidable opponent than any I'd faced before. It was indifferent to my qualifications, and unmoved by my determination. As I prepared to face another day of crushing heat with less than a liter of water remaining, I began to understand that survival would require more than knowledge and experience. It would require the kind of luck that no amount of geological training could guarantee. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I spotted what looked like a dark smudge against the red earth ahead. My cracked lips refused to form words of hope, but my pace quickened despite legs that felt like lead. Each step sent jolts of pain through my swollen feet, but the possibility of water drove me forward with renewed desperation. As I drew closer, the depression in the landscape revealed itself more clearly, a natural basin carved by countless years of rare but powerful desert floods. The waterhole was smaller than I'd dared to hope, perhaps 3 meters across at its widest point, but it held water. Real water, not the cruel mirages that had tormented me for days. I stumbled the final few meters and fell to my knees at the muddy edge. My hands trembled as I cupped the brackish liquid to my lips. It tasted of minerals and algae, with an earthy flavor that spoke of stagnation, but to me it was sweeter than any vintage wine. I forced myself to drink slowly despite every instinct screaming at me to gulp frantically. My geological training reasserted itself even in my desperation. Contaminated water could kill me just as surely as dehydration, perhaps more cruelly. But the water seemed clean enough, if not pristine. My body's desperate need overrode my scientific caution. After my second careful mouthful, I filled my water bottles. The familiar weight of liquid provided a comfort I'd almost forgotten existed. The waterhole sat in a natural amphitheater of rock that would provide precious shade during the day. Ancient Aboriginal pathways converged here, barely visible scratches in the desert pavement that spoke of thousands of years of human presence. This place had sustained life long before European eyes had ever seen the Great Sandy Desert. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to consider that I might actually survive. I made camp in the shade of the largest boulder, spreading my space blanket on the sandy ground and taking inventory of my remaining supplies. My emergency food was nearly gone, but the water changed everything. Here I could rest, recover my strength, and plan my next move with something approaching rationality, instead of the desperate flight that had characterized my past week of walking. The days at the waterhole passed in a haze of recovery. My body began the slow process of rehydration, though my kidneys produced only small amounts of dark, concentrated urine that reminded me how close I'd come to complete kidney failure. My headaches gradually subsided. My mind cleared enough for me to make more thoughtful decisions about my situation. The constant mental fog of severe dehydration lifted like morning mist, revealing the full scope of how impaired my thinking had become. I spent hours studying my maps and GPS unit, carefully plotting potential routes to civilization. The waterhole wasn't marked on my maps, but its position relative to known landmarks gave me a better sense of where I was in the vast emptiness of the desert. The calculations were sobering. I still had at least 200 kilometers to cover, possibly more, before reaching any form of help. On my fourth day at the waterhole, I made the difficult decision to continue my journey. My body had recovered enough to travel, and I couldn't afford to wait much longer. The water source might dry up, or rescue teams might search this area and move on if I wasn't here. Most importantly, I couldn't shake the feeling that every day I delayed reduced my chances of ultimate survival. The desert had taught me that hope deferred could become hope denied. Leaving the waterhole felt like abandoning a lifeline. But I filled every container I could carry and set out again into the endless expanse of sand and stone. This time my pace was more measured, informed by hard-won experience about the desert's capacity for punishment. I'd learned to read the subtle signs that preceded the day's worst heat, to identify the kinds of vegetation that might indicate slightly more favorable conditions ahead. The walking was still brutal, but I now moved with the careful efficiency of someone who understood the true stakes of every decision. I rationed my water more precisely, tracked my progress more carefully, and paid closer attention to my body's warning signs. The desert had nearly killed me once. It wouldn't catch me quite so unprepared again. But the reprieve provided by the waterhole was temporary. Within days of resuming my journey, the familiar enemies returned: the crushing heat, the burning sun, the way horizons seemed to retreat as fast as I could approach them. My water supplies, though carefully managed, once again began their inexorable decline towards zero. The landscape offered no comfort, no mercy, no sign that human civilization had ever existed, or ever would. My second bout of severe dehydration came with symptoms I recognized, but couldn't prevent. The headaches returned with vengeance, joined by nausea that made it difficult to keep down even the small amounts of food I still possessed. My urine darkened again to the color of strong tea, then stopped altogether as my kidneys began shutting down to preserve what little fluid remained in my system. More troubling were the effects on my mind. Thoughts became scattered, decisions increasingly difficult to make. I'd find myself standing motionless in the blazing sun, having forgotten whether I was supposed to be walking or resting. Time became elastic, minutes stretching into hours while hours compressed into moments of startling clarity that revealed just how precarious my situation had become. The hallucinations began on my 15th day of walking, 8 days after leaving the waterhole. At first, they were subtle, sounds that might have been voices on the wind, movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. My scientifically trained mind recognized these as symptoms of severe dehydration and heat stress, but, understanding their cause, provided no protection against their effects. By the third week, the hallucinations had become vivid and persistent. I held conversations with colleagues who weren't there, responded to questions asked by voices that existed only in my failing brain. I saw vehicles approaching in the distance and would wave frantically for help, only to watch them dissolve into heat, shimmer, and empty sky. The line between reality and delusion blurred until I could no longer trust my own perceptions. The psychological torment was worse than the physical suffering. I'd always prided myself on my mental discipline, my ability to analyze problems rationally and find solutions through careful thought. But the desert was stripping away my cognitive abilities layer by layer, reducing me to something more primitive and desperate than I'd ever imagined possible. In my clearer moments, I understood that I was losing my mind along with my body. The Robert Bagucki who'd confidently set out on a routine geological survey might not survive even if my physical form somehow made it to safety. 300 kilometers away, in the offices of the Western Australia Police, my disappearance was triggering the largest search and rescue operation the region had seen in years. My failure to return from what should have been a simple 3-day survey had initially been attributed to vehicle trouble or communication equipment failure. But when ground teams found my abandoned ute with no sign of me, the scope of the emergency became clear. Detective Senior Constable Graham Bell coordinated the search from a temporary command post in Newman. He studied maps and weather reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. I'd disappeared during one of the hottest weeks on record, with temperatures exceeding 45 degrees Celsius across much of the Great Sandy Desert. If I was walking, which seemed the only logical explanation for my absence from the vehicle, I was facing conditions that could kill an unprepared person within days. The search teams faced an almost impossible task. The Great Sandy Desert stretched across more than 350,000 square kilometers, an area larger than many countries. I could have walked in any direction from my abandoned vehicle. Without knowing my intentions or destination, searchers were looking for a single person across a space the size of Germany. The harsh terrain made ground searches extremely dangerous for the rescue teams themselves. Aerial searches were hampered by the vast distances involved and the difficulty of spotting a lone figure in the endless expanse of sand and rock. Helicopter crews from the Royal Australian Air Force joined the search, flying careful grid patterns across the most likely routes I might have taken. The pilots flew low and slow, their trained eyes scanning for any sign of human presence, footprints, abandoned equipment, or the bright orange emergency gear that might make me visible from the air. But the desert below revealed nothing. Its ancient surface remained unmarked by any trace of the man who was fighting for his life somewhere in its depths. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded to include volunteer pilots, mining company aircraft, and anyone with access to aircraft willing to join the effort. The Aboriginal communities of the region provided invaluable knowledge about water sources and traditional travel routes that might have attracted me during my desperate journey. Station managers and mine workers kept watch along remote roads and tracks, hoping to spot a figure walking through the emptiness. But the Great Sandy Desert kept its secrets. Day after day, the aircraft returned with negative reports. The radio chatter filled with the disappointed voices of pilots and observers who'd found nothing but endless sand and stone. Weather conditions remained brutal, with temperatures that made survival increasingly unlikely as time passed. The unspoken understanding among the search teams was that they were probably looking for a body rather than a living man. But nobody was willing to voice that grim reality while any hope remained. Search Coordinator Bell found himself studying statistics he wished he didn't know. The survival time for an average person in desert conditions without water rarely exceeded 3 days. Even with emergency supplies and desert experience, a person couldn't be expected to survive more than a week in the current temperatures. I'd been missing for over 2 weeks, a time frame that pushed well beyond the boundaries of reasonable hope. But the search continued, driven by the remote possibility that my geological expertise might have helped me find water or shelter that could extend my survival time. The scale of the operation was unprecedented for the region. Aircraft logged thousands of hours searching patterns across the desert, while ground teams followed every track and trail that might have attracted a desperate man seeking help. Police contacted mining operations, cattle stations, and Aboriginal communities across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, asking everyone to watch for any sign of the missing geologist. The search had become personal for many of the participants, a test of their determination against the desert's indifference to human life. The sacred site appeared to me like a mirage at first, shimmering in the heat of the late afternoon sun. Weathered sandstone formations rose from the desert floor in impossible shapes, their surfaces marked with ancient ochre paintings that seemed to watch me as I stumbled closer. My rational mind, what remained of it after weeks in the desert, recognized the significance of what I was seeing. These weren't random rock formations but deliberate markers, placed by hands that had understood this landscape for tens of thousands of years. I collapsed in the shade of the largest stone, my swollen tongue barely able to wet my cracked lips. The rock felt cool against my back, a blessed relief from the relentless heat that had become my constant companion. Above me, the ancient paintings depicted figures I couldn't fully comprehend, humans and animals moving across the stone in patterns that suggested journeys, hunting, survival. As my vision cleared, I began to notice details that my geological training had never prepared me to read. Wavy lines that could represent water sources. Circular symbols that might indicate camping places or meeting points. The entire rock face was a map, I realized, created by people who hadn't just survived in this desert but thrived here. The realization humbled me in ways that my previous weeks of struggle hadn't. I'd approached the Great Sandy Desert with the confidence of Western science, believing my geological knowledge and modern equipment would be sufficient to ensure my survival. But these paintings spoke of knowledge systems far more sophisticated than anything I'd learnt in university. They'd been accumulated over millennia of intimate relationship with this harsh landscape. The traditional owners hadn't simply endured the desert, they'd read it like a book, understanding its rhythms and secrets in ways that allowed entire communities to flourish here. I found myself studying the paintings with new eyes, looking for patterns that might teach me something about survival. The human figures in the art moved with purpose, following paths marked by symbols I was beginning to interpret as landmarks and resources. Water sources were indicated not just by wavy lines, but by specific combinations of symbols that seemed to describe not just location, but seasonal availability, quality, and the ceremonies required to approach them respectfully. This wasn't just art, it was an encyclopedia of survival knowledge encoded in ochre and stone. As night fell around the sacred site, I experienced something unexpected. Despite my exhaustion and dehydration, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The desert that had seemed so hostile and alien now revealed itself as a place where humans had always belonged, provided they approached it with the right knowledge and respect. The Aboriginal people who'd created these paintings hadn't conquered the desert or fought against it. They'd learned to move within its rhythms, to read its subtle signs, to find abundance where I saw only emptiness. The painting seemed to shift in the firelight from my small signal mirror, the figures dancing across the stone as shadows moved. I began to understand that my struggle wasn't just about physical survival, but about learning to see the desert as something other than an enemy to be defeated. The traditional owners had survived here not through dominance, but through relationship, not by imposing their will on the landscape, but by learning to participate in its ancient patterns. When morning came, I felt compelled to perform some gesture of respect before leaving the sacred site. My anthropological knowledge was limited, but I understood enough to know that I was a visitor in a place of profound significance. I gathered a small pile of stones, arranging them in a simple cairn as an offering of respect to the traditional owners whose knowledge had begun to shift my understanding of survival. The act felt inadequate, but it was all I could offer in my weakened state. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Carved into the base of one of the stones was a symbol I'd seen repeated throughout the site, a series of connected circles that seemed to represent a journey or pathway. Following the direction the symbol indicated, I spotted something that made my heart race. In a small depression barely visible from any other angle, water had collected from recent rainfall. It wasn't much, perhaps a liter of muddy, leaf-filled liquid. But it was water. The ancient knowledge encoded in the sacred site had guided me to life. I drank carefully, filtering the water through a piece of cloth torn from my shirt. The taste was earthy and bitter, but it was the sweetest thing I'd experienced in days. As I rested beside this tiny waterhole, I began to understand that the traditional owners hadn't just marked water sources randomly. They'd created a network of knowledge that connected sacred sites with practical survival information, ensuring that travelers who approached the landscape with proper respect could find what they needed to survive. The revelation changed something fundamental in my approach to my journey. I'd been fighting the desert, trying to impose my will on an environment that seemed determined to kill me, but the sacred site had shown me a different way of being in this place. Instead of fighting, I could learn to read the subtle signs that had guided Aboriginal people across this landscape for countless generations. The desert wasn't empty, it was full of information for those who knew how to see it. Over the following days, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way certain plants clustered around underground water sources, the flight patterns of birds that might indicate the location of soaks or springs, the subtle changes in soil color that suggested different geological formations, and their potential for retaining moisture. My geological training combined with my growing respect for traditional knowledge began to form a hybrid survival strategy that felt more sustainable than my previous desperate wandering. But even this newfound wisdom couldn't completely overcome the brutal reality of my physical condition. By my 40th day in the desert, I'd pushed my body far beyond its normal limits. The brief respite provided by the water at the sacred site had been consumed days earlier. My situation had become critical once again. The desert heat seemed more intense than ever, pressing down on me like a physical weight that made each step an act of supreme will. My body was shutting down in ways that terrified me. The hallucinations that had been occasional visitors now arrived as constant companions, populating my vision with figures from my past and mirages of rescue that dissolved whenever I tried to approach them. My skin had taken on a leathery texture, burned and dried by weeks of exposure to the relentless sun. The simple act of walking had become a complex negotiation between my determination to survive and my body's insistent signals that it was time to stop. Time to lie down. Time to surrender to the peace that unconsciousness promised. My mind began to fracture under the strain. I found myself having conversations with people who weren't there, arguing with my deceased father about career choices, pleading with my ex-wife to bring me water. The boundary between memory and reality dissolved, leaving me uncertain whether the voices I heard were internal or external. Whether the figures I saw walking beside me were hallucinations or fellow travelers in some parallel version of my journey. Sometimes I believed I was still at my survey site, that the weeks of walking had been an elaborate dream. Other times I convinced myself I was already dead, wandering through some desert afterlife where the punishment for hubris was eternal, walking under an unforgiving sun. The physical symptoms were becoming impossible to ignore. My urine had become dark and scanty, then stopped altogether as my kidneys began to shut down. My heart raced even during periods of rest, struggling to circulate blood that had become thick and sluggish from dehydration. Simple movements required enormous effort. I found myself stopping frequently to rest, gasping for breath in the thin, superheated air. My lips had cracked so severely that they bled whenever I tried to speak, leaving me to communicate with my hallucinated companions through gestures and mumbled words that even I couldn't understand. Food had become irrelevant. My stomach had contracted into a hard knot that rejected any solid matter I tried to consume. The few remaining energy bars in my pack tasted like sawdust and sand, requiring precious saliva I couldn't spare to choke them down. My body had begun consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel basic functions, leaving me weak and unsteady on feet that had swollen beyond the capacity of my boots. Every step sent shockwaves of pain through legs that trembled with exhaustion and malnutrition. On my 42nd day in the desert, I reached what I'd later recognize as my breaking point. The sun had risen like a malevolent eye, promising another day of torture that my body simply couldn't endure. I'd been walking since before dawn, driven by the irrational fear that stopping would mean death. But my legs finally betrayed me. I collapsed beside a small acacia bush that provided barely enough shade to cover my head and shoulders. My body folded like a broken marionette onto the burning sand. For the first time since my ordeal began, I seriously considered giving up. The rational part of my mind, still functioning despite everything, calculated the odds of rescue and found them vanishingly small. I'd been walking for 6 weeks without seeing any sign of human activity. My supplies were exhausted, my body was failing. Even if searchers were looking for me, the vast expanse of the great sandy desert made finding one man virtually impossible. Death would come as a relief, an end to the suffering that had defined every moment of my existence for over a month. I lay in the inadequate shade of the acacia and felt my consciousness beginning to slip away. The hallucinations had become more vivid and comforting, offering me visions of cool water and air conditioning, of beds with clean sheets and meals prepared by loving hands. My mother appeared to me as she'd been when I was a child, offering me a glass of cold milk and promising that everything would be all right if I'd just close my eyes and rest. The temptation to surrender to these comforting visions was overwhelming, stronger than any desire I'd ever experienced. But something deep in my core, some stubborn spark of survival instinct that had carried me this far, refused to be extinguished. Even as my conscious mind embraced the idea of giving up, my body continued its basic functions. My heart continued to beat. My lungs continued to draw breath from the superheated air. The sacred site had taught me something about endurance that went beyond individual will, about the deep human capacity to survive in impossible circumstances when connected to something larger than personal desire. The traditional owners whose paintings I'd studied hadn't survived through superior strength or equipment but through connection to country, through knowledge that had been tested and refined over thousands of years. As I lay dying in the shade of the acacia, helicopters were crisscrossing the sky barely 20 kilometers away. The search operation had entered its 7th week, long past the point where anyone expected to find me alive. But the families of missing persons and the professional search teams had developed a grim determination that matched my own refusal to surrender. They'd continue looking until they found something, whether it was a living man or the closure that comes with recovering remains. The helicopter that finally spotted me was flying a pattern that had been searched multiple times before. Pilot Jenny Morrison had been part of the search from the beginning, volunteering her aircraft and expertise to the effort that had consumed the region's aviation resources for weeks. She was flying low and slow, following a grid pattern that covered the same territory she'd searched dozens of times before. The repetitive nature of the search had become almost meditative, a rhythm of hope and disappointment that characterized each flight. Morrison almost missed me. The figure lying beside the acacia bush was so still, so integrated into the landscape, that it barely registered as human. Only a flash of reflected light from my signal mirror, unconsciously positioned to catch the morning sun, drew her attention to the small patch of shade where I lay. Even then, she had to circle twice before she was certain she was looking at a person, rather than a piece of debris or a natural formation that resembled human shape. When Morrison finally confirmed the sighting, her radio call electrified the Search Coordination Center. "We've got him," she announced, her voice tight with disbelief and excitement. "Grid reference 77 Alpha. Single male, appears to be alive but barely moving." The coordinates she transmitted represented the culmination of one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history. The answer to questions that had haunted dozens of families and professional rescuers for over 6 weeks. The rescue itself was a testament to the skill and dedication of the medical teams who'd been waiting for this moment. A helicopter equipped with advanced medical equipment was airborne within minutes, carrying paramedics who'd been briefed on the likely condition of someone who'd survived in the desert for this length of time. They found me barely conscious, my vital signs weak but detectable. My body was so dehydrated that my skin had lost all elasticity, and my eyes had sunk deep into my skull. The initial medical assessment was sobering. My body weight had dropped by nearly 30%, and my organ functions were severely compromised by prolonged dehydration and malnutrition. My core temperature was dangerously elevated. My blood chemistry showed levels of dehydration that should have been fatal days earlier. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize me for transport, establishing IV lines to begin rehydration, and administering medications to support my failing kidneys and cardiovascular system. The flight to the regional hospital was touch and go, with me drifting in and out of consciousness while medical personnel fought to keep my vital signs stable. My first coherent words, whispered through cracked lips to the paramedic monitoring my condition, were a request for water and an apology to my family for the trouble I'd caused. The paramedic, a veteran of dozens of desert rescues, later said it was the first time he'd encountered someone who'd survived longer than 2 weeks in such conditions, let alone the 43 days that I'd endured. At the hospital, my case became a medical curiosity that drew specialists from across the region. My survival defied conventional wisdom about human endurance in extreme conditions, challenging textbook assumptions about the limits of human resilience. The medical team treating me had to develop protocols for rehydration and nutrition that accounted for the extreme duration of my deprivation. They carefully balanced the need for rapid intervention with the risk of shocking organs that had adapted to near-shutdown conditions. The media attention that followed my rescue was intense but respectful, focusing on the miraculous nature of my survival rather than sensationalizing my ordeal. Reporters struggled to convey the magnitude of my accomplishment, walking over 400 kilometers through one of Australia's most hostile environments while surviving for 43 days with minimal supplies. The story captured public imagination not just as a tale of survival but as a testament to human endurance and the power of refusing to give up in the face of impossible odds. During my lengthy recovery, as my body slowly rebuilt itself from the brink of collapse, I found myself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. The desert had stripped away more than just my physical strength. It had peeled back layers of assumption about what mattered in life, what constituted real hardship, and what the human spirit could endure when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The doctors told me my recovery was progressing remarkably well, considering the trauma my organs had sustained. But I knew the deeper transformation was just beginning to reveal itself. In the quiet hours of my hospital stay, when the steady beep of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses provided the only soundtrack, I replayed the 43 days in my mind with a clarity that surprised me. The memories weren't fading like most traumatic experiences. Instead, they seemed to be crystallizing into lessons that I was only now beginning to understand. The desert hadn't been trying to kill me, I realized. It had simply been indifferent to my survival, presenting me with conditions that existed regardless of my presence or my needs. This recognition brought with it a profound humility that changed how I viewed not just the Outback, but my place in the natural world. The Aboriginal sacred sites I'd encountered during my journey took on new meaning as I recovered. In those desperate days, struggling to comprehend how anyone could survive in such a landscape, I'd glimpsed the edge of knowledge systems that had sustained human life in the Great Sandy Desert for tens of thousands of years. My geological training had given me some tools for survival, but it paled in comparison to the sophisticated understanding of country that traditional owners possessed. The water sources I'd found, the animal tracks I'd followed, the subtle signs of seasonal change that had guided my decisions. All of these were part of a complex web of knowledge that indigenous peoples had developed through countless generations of living with the desert, rather than fighting against it. I began to understand that my survival hadn't been purely a matter of individual determination, or even geological expertise. I'd been the beneficiary of landscape management practices that stretched back millennia, walking paths that had been maintained by traditional burning and hunting practices, finding water at sites that had been protected and preserved through careful custodianship. The treks I'd followed weren't random, they connected resources in patterns that reflected deep understanding of how the desert sustained life. My gratitude extended beyond relief at my own survival, to encompass respect for the people who'd made that survival possible, through their long relationship with country. The physical recovery was measurable in blood tests and weight gain, but the psychological impact proved more complex. I found myself changed in ways that were difficult to articulate to friends and family who wanted to understand what I'd been through. The desert had taught me that the margin between life and death was thinner than most people imagined, but also that the human capacity for endurance was greater than I'd ever suspected. These weren't contradictory lessons, they reinforced each other, creating a worldview that was simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than what I'd carried into the Great Sandy Desert. Sleep brought dreams that transported me back to the endless horizons and relentless sun, but these weren't nightmares. Instead, they were reminders of moments when I'd felt most completely present, most aware of the fundamental processes that sustained life. The taste of water at the small waterhole, the relief of shade during the hottest parts of the day, the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other when everything in my body demanded that I stop. These experiences had revealed essential truths about what it meant to be human in a world that didn't owe me comfort or safety. When reporters asked me how I'd maintained hope during the darkest moments of my ordeal, I found their questions difficult to answer directly. Hope, as they understood it, suggested a kind of optimism about outcomes that I hadn't possessed for much of my time in the desert. What had sustained me was something more fundamental, a stubborn refusal to accept that my story would end in the sand and spinifex of the Great Sandy Desert. This wasn't hope in any conventional sense, it was a kind of elemental resistance to extinction that seemed to operate below the level of conscious thought. The media coverage of my survival had focused understandably on the dramatic aspects of my story, the distance walked, the days survived, the moment of rescue. But I knew these measurements, impressive as they were, missed the deeper significance of what had happened to me. The desert had taught me about time in ways that clocks and calendars couldn't capture. Days had stretched into eternities when water was scarce, while moments of discovery or relief had passed with startling quickness. I'd learned to measure progress not in kilometers covered but in small victories, finding shade, locating water, successfully rationing supplies for another day. The experience had also revealed the arbitrary nature of many of the concerns that had dominated my pre-desert life. Problems that had seemed urgent and important now appeared as distractions from more fundamental questions about how to live with awareness of life's fragility and preciousness. The desert hadn't made me indifferent to ordinary concerns, but it had given me perspective on their relative importance. Career advancement, financial security, social status, all of these mattered, but they existed in a context larger than I'd previously recognized. My family struggled to understand my changed perspective, interpreting my newfound philosophical bent as a form of trauma response that would fade as I returned to normal life. They weren't entirely wrong. My ordeal had certainly been traumatic, but trauma wasn't the whole story. The desert had also been a teacher, albeit one that employed harsh pedagogical methods. The lessons weren't comfortable, but they were profound, about the difference between surviving and living, about the relationship between preparation and adaptability, about the importance of respecting forces larger than individual will. As my strength returned and discharge from the hospital approached, I found myself thinking about how to honor what the desert had taught me. Simply returning to my previous life seemed like a betrayal of the insights I'd gained, but I also recognized the danger of treating my survival as a mandate for reckless adventure-seeking. The desert hadn't made me invulnerable. If anything, it had shown me just how vulnerable I truly was. The difference was that vulnerability no longer felt like weakness. It felt like truth. The scientific community's interest in my survival presented an opportunity to contribute to understanding of human endurance in extreme conditions. Researchers wanted to study my physiological responses, my decision-making processes, my psychological coping mechanisms. I welcomed these inquiries, recognizing that my experience might help others who found themselves in similar situations. But I also insisted that any scientific examination of my survival acknowledge the role of indigenous knowledge systems in making my rescue possible. Speaking engagements and interview requests poured in as news of my recovery spread. I accepted some of these opportunities, but I was selective about my message. I didn't want to present myself as a hero, or to suggest that my survival was primarily a matter of superior preparation or exceptional toughness. The desert had saved me as much as I'd saved myself. The people who'd maintained that desert landscape for millennia deserved recognition for their role in my story. The geologist in me remained fascinated by the technical aspects of desert survival. I spent hours during my recovery analyzing the decisions I'd made, trying to understand which had been crucial and which had been lucky. But I also recognized that this analytical approach, valuable as it was, couldn't capture everything important about my experience. Some of what had sustained me existed beyond the reach of scientific measurement. The determination that had kept me walking when walking seemed pointless. The intuition that had guided me toward water. The moments of clarity that had emerged from exhaustion and desperation. When I finally left the hospital, walking on my own power for the first time since my rescue, I carried with me a responsibility that I was still learning to understand. My survival had made me a kind of ambassador between two worlds, the comfortable, predictable environment where most people lived their lives, and the harsh, indifferent landscape, where survival depended on constant attention to fundamental needs. The challenge was finding ways to honor both worlds without betraying either. The great sandy desert hadn't made me into a different person, but it had revealed aspects of my character and capabilities that might have remained hidden in ordinary circumstances. The man who'd walked 400 kilometers and survived 43 days in one of Australia's most unforgiving landscapes was the same person who'd driven into the desert to conduct geological surveys. But I was also more than I'd been before. The desert had taught me that human beings were capable of far more than they usually imagined, but also that this capacity came with obligations to respect the forces and systems that made such endurance possible. As I prepared to rebuild my life with this knowledge, I understood that my real journey was just beginning. The desert had given me a gift, the recognition of my own resilience, and the importance of living with full awareness of life's preciousness. How I used that gift would determine whether my survival had meaning beyond its own improbable drama. The Outback had tested me and found me capable, but it had also taught me humility. In the end, that combination of confidence and respect might be the most valuable lesson the great sandy desert had to offer. If you've ever been lost in country like that, you know the silence gets into your bones. Hit like and subscribe. More stories from the Outback are coming, and every one of them reminds you to respect the land that's been here long before any of us.